Ladies and gentlemen, this podcast episode, I have a great conversation with my guest, Ben. We discuss his book and how he talks about what is justice. A very simple question, but a very complex one at the same time, because how people take justice into their own hands is something that has been an issue, especially in our current political climate. We discuss things regarding America, America's faults, America's goodness, so to speak, and how there are different aspects of humanity and empathy that is very valuable that we're losing in today's political climate. I think this is a great conversation. Feel free to check his book out in the description and let us know what you think in the comments. Or you can email me what you think. Feel free to do that as well. I'm done yapping. Let's go get to that podcast episode. Cha-ching. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. This is the Purple Political Breakdown. How's it going? How's your day been? We are back at it again. It's been a while since we had a guest episode. A lot of changing pieces the last couple of weeks. Well, we got an excellent guest today to talk about some aspects that I do think are always interesting to dive into, especially in regards to the book that he wants to talk about, and in regards to political injustices and what that encapsulates and how that reflects current political society today. So, of course, if you guys enjoy, rate the podcast 5 stars, share with your friends and family, all that good stuff. You already know how it goes. But I'm allowing him to introduce himself. So go ahead, Ben. Who are you? What's your book about?
Hi. Yeah. Well, firstly, thanks up for having me on the show. It's lovely to be here today on this Saturday. But my name is Ben. Ben C. Davies is what I write under, and I'm from the UK, as you can probably tell from my accent. But I'm currently based out in the US and have been for a number of years. My book is my debut collection, which came out just over a month ago now, and it's called "And So I Took Their Eye." And we'll obviously go into a little bit more about the book and themes about the book through the course of the podcast. But aside from the book, I'm an editor at the Ginosco Literary Journal. I teach at the California College of Arts, and I co-run and direct a Guatemalan writing and artist residency called Studio Luz, which is based down in Guatemala, and also offer marketing and publicity to a number of authors as well. So do a lot of things in the kind of book world and supporting the arts, but primarily here today to talk about my own book.
All right, excellent. Before we kind of dive into that, I always like to let people know a little bit about the guests beyond the kind of political talking points. What's like a hobby of yours? What makes you relatable to the average person that goes like, okay, he's not just a political pundit that just yaps about boring stuff all day.
Yeah, I'm definitely not that. I mean, I feel as a writer, it's an incredibly boring answer to say that I like to read and write, because I feel like that goes there with the territory. But aside from that, I like a lot of sport. I surf. I play football, or soccer, as it is better known out here, and spend a lot of time with music as well. I have a growing vinyl collection that is my pride and joy.
Okay, nice. My roommate has a vinyl collection too. Never got into it when I was younger. Is that so? For a vinyl collector, are you going to just keep it all until you grow old, or is this keep it and then sell it once it raises in value type thing?
No, it was never growing up. It was always CDs that we had in the house, and then my parents had like this huge vinyl collection from when they were like teenagers, and they had held on to it, and all of these old records of like the Beatles and Miles Davis and David Bowie, and they had all of these records, and then they had moved on to new formats, and they were like, "Do you want these vinyls?" And so I, took all of their vinyl collection, and then that kind of started in me wanting to do it more. And now, there's so many different ways to consume music, but I love having that like physical thing that you can be intentional about to put on like one album to listen to that night, instead of podcasts and Spotify and all of these different other alternatives. I don't know, it makes you listen to something. I think it changes the engagement with music, and so I love it for that. So I will hold on to them and pass them on when the time comes as well, to my kids.
I respect it. What's your favorite vinyl you have? What's your favorite album?
That's one of I don't know if I can answer that question. I think it depends on the mood. I have a lot of very relaxing music, a lot of very mellow music, but then I don't know. I love some of the other stuff. Like some of the records that my parents gave to me, like Kind of Blue by Miles Davis or Sgt. Pepper's by the Beatles, or I got a lot of modern singer-songwriters that I listen to a lot. And there's an Indian band actually called Peter Cat Recording Company, who is a modern day band who kind of mix every genre out there. And I love to put them on whilst cooking. It's like fun, it's upbeat, and it's a change from a lot of my normal music, which can be kind of depressing and slow paced.
I know what you mean. I delved into a lot of different things too. With that includes the more depressing music as well. Shout out, that's an interesting hobby. So to kind of go into this, when it comes down to your political identity or political background, how would you define it for people that are like curious?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting coming on this show because obviously you try and you're looking at different, sides of the political spectrum, and I imagine a lot of the listeners are here. I mean, I would say that my role in that is that I am like completely disillusioned with both in the UK and the US of like the two main parties that you have in both systems, be it Democrats and the Labour Party in the UK, and then the Republicans and the Conservatives as well on the other side. And I definitely am not like attuned to either political party, and the book really explores that. Like, I myself definitely have a far more like overall like leftist view or socialist view that I come from, or the background that I come from. But the book itself is not like, it's not coming on here today to talk about that. And the book itself is not presenting this like left-wing narrative of like, this is like the right answer, because it's actually incredibly critical of the Democrat Party or left-wing institutions in the US today, and in not so much in the UK in the book, as much as it is as a lot of right-wing institutions. And like it tries to look from a vantage point away from that political kind of sphere that we're built in, where we have to look at this world in such like a binary way. It's like, are you Democrat or are you Republican? Are you Labour? Are you Conservative? And the book takes a step back from that, and it's trying to really kind of understand people. And it is a very, I would say, like empathetic book at trying to, and it chimes in with my own beliefs of like trying to see people as people and how that relates to us as human beings and how we treat other people, which is not necessarily in line with how politics is today.
I definitely agree to that. When it comes down to the polarization of the different political parties, especially in America, I do see it from a distance when it comes to the UK and like certain clips or news articles that I see here and there. But I typically just focus on what's going on in America, and I'm very much adherent to that. That's why, purple, I just identify with my values. I don't really care about adhering to a structure. All my beliefs have to align to a particular side. And that gets in the way. Oftentimes when you boil it down, you could see a lot of people are tend to agree with some core principles that I wouldn't as far as go as like humanitarian, but they care about people's rights and they care about, individual liberties. But then when you add the dividing line, it seems like all of that kind of goes away just to adhere to your platform, and that becomes extremely problematic, especially in today's climate where it's super toxic. So I am 100% with you when it comes to kind of that and focusing on like important issues.
I think you see like the moral kind of gymnastics that people have to go through at times to justify something that is probably not in line with their political beliefs. But if it's like the party line or what is like part of, say, like MAGA or what it is to be a Democrat, then people will often like manipulate or change their beliefs to then start like justifying something that they never would have previously justified. And especially as all of these institutions become more polarized or more extreme, you see that more and more. And it also shows up in, the way that I think certain members in the Democrats or the left like to present themselves and showcase themselves. And then the reality of their politics is not always doing that. They like to put themselves sometimes on a pedestal, and then they're not actually acting that out. And I think that's also like the same kind of thing. It's like we're fitting everyone into boxes, and these boxes I don't think work anymore. And there's this human aspect that is more important and more central, but it isn't given much space today.
I definitely agree, and I do think there's a level of authenticity that regardless of how much, and people know this on my podcast, and even if my guests come here, I'm not a fan of MAGA by any means, but the only thing you can take away from Trump's platform is he seems authentic. So when it comes down to like the side on the left, that is one criticism is like be who you are and not try to pretend to adhere to like votes that you don't necessarily believe in. That could help a lot as well. All right, so let's kind of go into the book. Before we do that, I'm sure there is a catalyst. Like there's always a reason why people go out of their way to push a particular message. For example, for me, when it comes to down this podcast, I looked at the state of affairs and I started what I was doing right now and having all these very valuable conversations. So, what is your inspiration? What inspired you to make this book and push this particular message?
Um, yeah, it was kind of like I've always liked to write, and I had some other that were also quite political books that I was kind of working on that were very UK based. But they kind of, I don't know, they're just ideas, things that didn't get off the ground or whatever. But then this is shorter stories, but I used to live in Guatemala for a number of years. So I was kind of lived there between 2014 and 2018, but I still have like a very ongoing relationship with the country. I return regularly. We run this writing residency down there now. And I lived in a small village down on the Pacific coast of Guatemala, and absolutely adore the country, my time there, the people. But there is definitely certain aspects of the culture and the life that really got me thinking, which then probably were the catalyst for this book. It's not just exclusive to Guatemala. It has roots in the Bible, but then it's across other countries across the world. But this idea of an eye for an eye, this kind of you do this to me, and then the reciprocal justice idea is very strong in Guatemala. It's very lived by, and I was firstly, an event happened in Guatemala, a really awful and tragic event involving someone I knew that was due to this philosophy of an eye for an eye. But then it got me, after that, I spent a lot of time thinking about that. And I was involved a while back in conversations in Guatemala where there was like Westerners who were living in Guatemala who were very into that idea and wanted to kind of like enforce that idea in this community that we were living in. And I kind of started thinking about this idea of like justice and revenge and how that is enacted in Guatemala, but then how that kind of plays out in other countries across the world. And so the first story of the book is set in Guatemala, and it's influenced by that. It's also influenced by the CIA-led coup that happened there in 1954. But then I started thinking of like, what is justice or what is revenge in the UK? How does it manifest itself in Silicon Valley? Like, it might not be that, say, someone gets killed and someone then kills them in return, but it still, I felt like, showed itself up, and it does show itself up in different countries and in different ways, sometimes very like subtle ways, sometimes very, kind of more aggressive or violent ways, but it's still very prevalent in a lot of these countries. And I've been lucky enough to like travel a lot through my life. I've lived and traveled through lots of countries around the world, and I kind of started thinking about all of those countries, those experiences, and how does this idea or this concept show itself in these other countries, and why does it show itself? Like, what are people searching for, and why does this happen, and why is it more extreme in other countries than this country, and that kind of thing. And so that started the book. And then I started with the Guatemala story, and then I just kind of went on this journey where it was as much an exploration whilst I was writing them as it was kind of writing it for people. I was kind of exploring this concept. And so in the process of writing them, I kind of myself was able to explore my feelings around this. I did research. I spoke to different people from different countries to try and kind of understand it more. And especially in Guatemala. And then that just kind of led one story into the next. And the book itself, it all links from one story to the next. So it's a collection, but you could read it as a whole. And that was because there were so many connections I found in this general, like, overarching concept. And yeah, that's effectively how it came to be. That was the catalyst. And then I kind of just took it from there.
It's very interesting. I always value the aspect of, and this is what I preach consistently on my podcast on like multiple episodes, is that one of the best ways for your people to really understand the different point of view is changing your perspective and increasing the amount of experiences you have, because there's so many things that happen in the world that people don't realize that these type of situations create a different custom and a different way of life that inherently may seem different, but a lot of the core principles can be very much aligned when you get down to like who they are as an individual. And that when it comes down to people creating these overarching brushes of like oftentimes very, very negative connotations, it just oftentimes comes from a place of ignorance, which we see throughout human history in general. So that's why there's so much value in experiencing these different places and meeting these different cultures and these different people, and how they can kind of shape your point of view. My next question here is like, you said experiencing these people really changed kind of like basically your perception on like what is justice. Well, that's one of the core things that you talked about. And then one of the big questions that I'm very curious to kind of dive into that was sent to me, so we can kind of use this as a brush to kind of go into different lanes of this conversation, is that the question that was sent to me regarding your book is, what happens when we take justice into our own hands? And more importantly, what does it reveal about the world we live in and the kind of world we want to build? The term justice is very powerful and it can mean very interesting things to different people. So let's start off with defining, in your opinion, what is justice?
Yeah, I had this, I was talking about this the other day, and I think it's a complicated one because, revenge is also another word that kind of comes into this, and that is obviously very different to justice in one sense, but I think there is like elements of that. And I think in the concept of the book, it's very much exploring people taking their own justice. So it's very much about like people feeling, and I think this is maybe, you can talk about justice in terms of like the judicial system, but this is more very much looking at it in terms of like, what is almost like rightfully like mine, what am I owed? And that could manifest itself in revenge, but it's more about, what is my place in this, on this planet, or in this like moment, and like what do I almost deserve as a human, and what's being taken from me, and how do I get justice with equality, or that comes into it as well. I think people are fighting for what they feel is owed, not necessarily owed to them, or what they deserve, or what is right. And I think we live in a deeply unequal time in society in the United States. There's like an erosion on human rights across the world right now in so many different forms, and people are not getting maybe what they deserve from life. And so this was very much looking at how you can how people are claiming that, or how they feel they can claim what is owed to them. And this can be on such like a major level. This plays out in huge ways across the world, in like geopolitical stakes, but it also is on like a minor level in like the terms of like a friendship or a relationship, and like what you are owed in there. And so it's not looking at justice in terms of this broad stroke, like what it like the systems necessarily in place, but it's like, how do we fight for our own justice, or our own what is right for us, or how do we get what is owed to us in society today? And that's what the book is exploring. So it's kind of it's complicated to explain, because it's not just looking at it in that traditional sense of what we know as justice.
Fair enough. I do think a lot of that people kind of boil down to the terms of like, what are your rights? What are your human rights, so to speak? And there's always the question on like, are these rights embedded into you when you are born? So I guess the next thing is, when it comes down to an individual and they live in a system, and we can obviously point out more very, very blatant, obvious corrupt systems that live in the world. That's like very easy to identify. The ones that are more successful have proven to be create a lot more opportunities than other. Obviously, still have big problems, and we're seeing, for example, in the United States, those problems being challenged extremely as of right now, when our current institutions are being challenged, our checks and balances are being challenged. The big thing that a lot of people bring up, of course, regardless of all the kind of growth that America has been through, is that the wealth disparity gap is continuously growing. And now we're consolidating more power into the government more than ever before. So when you live in a system that, in all intents and purposes, is probably the most successful big system in human history, but it does have all these issues, how do you deal with this? How do you, as an individual, try to fight for the rights that you're owed?
Yeah, I mean, I wish there was a straightforward answer to that, and I could be the one to give it. And I don't know if that is the case. I think firstly, to go to the first point, I think that yes, I think this like fighting for your rights or what is owed is dependent on like the structures and systems that are in place around you. And one thing that I believe and like try to explore is that I think that obviously the more structures or around you that support you, be it the state, be it the government, be it a family or a community, the less of a need there is for this kind of justice, because you have these support networks around you. But most people right now, or a lot of people, do not have that. And I think in the United States, that's very stark right now, as you say, like there's this widening gap. As to like how that can be changed, I mean, I have my own views on that aside from the book, that I think that like right now the current administration is going to only largen that gap, that the US is on course for some kind of reckoning that is not going to be good for the majority of the population. I do believe in a more, I believe in taxes. I believe in the state. I was born in the UK. I spent a year doing my master's in Sweden, which Sweden obviously has a more or traditionally socialist governments that provide healthcare, education for free, that have a lot of protection from the state, which in turn has led to far less wealth disparity. It's changing a little bit in Scandinavia at the moment. The US, I think, is a more individualistic country. People don't like necessarily being told what to do as much here in comparison, maybe. And, people, there is less protection from the state. You have to pay for your healthcare. A lot of education, especially at college level, is like obscenely expensive. And I think that causes these widening gaps, which then cause people to get more, they're more desperate. They run out of more, there are far more barriers in place to change your life situation because you don't have that kind of support from the state. And then when those barriers are in place, people are forced to, I think, more, into paths they might not want to originally have gone down. But like, I don't think it's something that's born into you necessarily. It is maybe in certain aspects, but it's, your life situation influences you in lots of ways, and people have to kind of, fight for that.
You name something very interesting, and I do think that is an important point to kind of distinguish. There is a difference between a community that is shared, and my guess, the individuals that you've met or the communities you met, and you can let me know if I'm wrong, that's perfectly fine, is that those communities are much more like pitching in, right? It's the idea of like a shared community that is, improving while everyone is kind of giving into it. And it's the simple premise of like the increase of taxes to get better care that a lot of these Scandinavian countries have, right? And it's not, I know people hear these type of things and they automatically assume that this is just outright socialism. It's not, but it's the principle of obviously you guys giving into so you can have better certain baseline rights or baseline amenities or just things that are just helps the average person a lot better in said community, in said country, in said whatever you want to call it. So those individuals, there is that kind of culture that really understands this. And when I did my like explanation on like what is socialism, one thing that I've gathered from like Scandinavian countries that are not socialist countries but understand the meaning of high taxes is like, we are perfectly fine with it because we know we get, like you said, healthcare, better free education, all this stuff. And then when you come to America, you go like, hey, what do you think about raising taxes? They all hate it. Every single person hates it all across the board. So I don't know whether this is in your book or in your personal view. I'm very curious. How do you articulate to the people who don't see this vision of like buying in for everyone else and focus on more of this kind of individualistic rights where it's like, hey man, I only care about me, give me my money, I don't really care about all these other things. Like, how do you reach to them?
Yeah, I mean, I think actually me going in, like saying the word like socialism is actually, that's one way definitely not to do it, because it's such a like such a toxic word in the United States. I remember in the lead up to the last election, and like people were saying that Kamala Harris was a socialist, which she 100% wasn't, for like in lots of ways. She herself would even say that she was a capitalist, but like just that word causes such a fear in the United States. I don't know if it dates back to McCarthyism or whatever, but that is not the way to bridge the gap. But I do believe that human beings generally or fundamentally care about other human beings. I think that is like a core thing, like in human nature, that yes, there are definitely people in the United States who do not care about everyone, and the current rhetoric around immigration is like an example of that, which is obviously linked to like race, culture, all of these different things, and that is a reality in the United States today. But on the flip side of that, I do think that there is an innate thing in being a human where you care for the welfare of other human beings. That might just be for some people that's a very closed circle, but I think for the vast majority of the population, they do care. And we talked about it earlier when we were talking about when I said about writing the book, and that like the empathy that comes from like travel and like being in other cultures, and I think that isn't a great way to break it down, because it's like, I think once people see other parts of the world, you go live in other parts of the United States, or you just see other communities within your own city or your own area, that breaks down all of these barriers that people have built up. But it doesn't happen on a large scale. It probably won't ever happen. But I think those are kind of like the roads that need to be taken. I'm a big believer in like the arts, in literature, nonfiction as well, but also like TV, film, all of these different things. And I think that when like stories are centered around other people who maybe are not as fortunate as yourself, or whatever kind of discrimination takes place, I think those are ways that can break it down, when people are suddenly see like, this is how, like the Latinx community is being treated in the United States, or this is what is happening. Like I'm actually seeing with my own eyes what is happening in Gaza right now, or what is happening in Ukraine. And like when people can see those visual stories, I think that I think that plays an impact. Like I believe that the arts and like all of these in all its different mediums can play a role. But there's obviously no like easy answer to this. I think if there was, then like I like to think that politicians would have gone down that road long ago. I may be cynical towards like the political institutions in lots of countries, but I think if there was an answer, that would be followed. But I do think it's about increasing like interaction, increasing like understanding, and which in turn impacts empathy, which then I think when you have that empathy, and I think my book is very empathetic towards other cultures and identities, from that, then you're like, actually, I don't agree with what, say, ICE is doing right now. And that changes how then you might be like, actually, if I paid a bit more tax, maybe this would help people who are really vulnerable right now, who are living out on like the streets of San Francisco and who have no support from the state. I think that can have an influence, but it's also probably idealistic.
Yeah, I'm with you in the terms of like the value of empathy is definitely being lost, and it is being kind of hyper focused on me. But I do think if they were able to visualize, hell, if they were able to meet the consequences of like certain things that they advocate for, they would truly understand like how problematic it is. One guy who was a big like human rights advocate who came on the podcast said this, and either him or another lady said this, and they talked about like most people, if they see a car that is in like on fire and someone is stuck, most people will try to help them. Like that's just
Yeah.
generally true. However, then we kind of see the current climate is like, bro, how do you advocate for that, for this stuff right now? And that's because they're kind of detaching. They don't want to see it. And another
Yeah.
good example to it is like the USAID stuff, for example. Like people are like, oh yeah, let's take that money away, not realizing the millions of dollars are going to be taken away from these places because they refuse to kind of look at them, and they're going to be suffering, whether it's food or whether it's like diseases. They just don't, they can't visualize the amount of suffering that's going to be taken away or that's going to be added onto them, because now they're going to be losing money or losing resources just because X, Y, and Z reason for individual. And that's why these stories and these media, these narratives that you're kind of pointing out is valuable, because these people won't fly there, they won't walk there, they won't go there, but they may read something or they may watch something that might click in their brains like, damn, I didn't realize. Now, some people will watch it and then the next day, like, oh, I forgot about it. But that is valuable. Go ahead. You about to say something?
No. I completely agree. I completely agree. We were, just as like a side note, last week there's like a new, I think it's like a Spike Lee produced documentary on Hurricane Katrina that's out now on Netflix. And I watched it last week, and I knew about Katrina, but I didn't know about it. And like watching that documentary, for example, and like seeing the stories of the individuals that were like affected, seeing like the way that the police and the looting that didn't really happen, and like the way that the communities came together though as well, or some communities came together to support each other, while there was others that didn't. Like regardless, it created this whole empathy in me for New Orleans and what New Orleans went through that I never really had in much depth before, because I knew of Katrina, but I didn't really like know it. And then I watched this documentary, I heard these individual stories, and like you were suddenly so involved and so invested and thinking about this city and everything it had been through. And I think that that's where the arts can play a role, and like that's the impact it can have in lots of different ways.
Is there any particular stories that you've written in your book that you believe can provide this level of empathy or understanding to an individual, or kind of at least outline some type of similar message?
Um, no, I mean, there's there's a few stories that it's different. There's one that was actually very based in my own experience, that I then kind of rewrote, imagining two other characters who were involved in the story, instead of taking myself out of the story. But I was kind of exploring how someone very different to myself might have reacted in this scenario. But when I was it was actually my honeymoon. I was on it with my wife, and we were in Greece, and I woke up one morning to go for a swim in this quite sheltered like cove on the island of Milos, and woke up and walked out, and there was a boat like half turned in the water, and kids and children, women and children, all like screaming on board, men jumping off the boat. And it was a boat that was full of Syrians who had come from Turkey, and they were headed for Italy, but the boat had kind of been left out at sea by the smugglers, for one, I don't know what the correct term is there, but it washed up on shore. And it became this whole thing that me and my wife got very involved in, trying to help this one person on the boat. But I think like that, again, was a very real experience for me, in that, again, I was very aware of like, the boats in the English Channel, and I knew stories about, what people are going through on these dangerous crossings. But then suddenly it was like confronted right in front of me, waking up one morning to this. And then we were very involved in it and trying to help and support some of the people. And I tried to bring that into one of the stories, or I did retell that story. And it has like a different slant where it talks about that. It has this kind of egotistical character who tries to like center his own experiences, that story, instead of like the refugees. But I do think like the moments like that, things like that are, I don't know, I hope when someone reads it, they have like a very real understanding. And maybe it'll be dismissed because in their eyes it's fictional, but like, if this thing is happening, like this is happening every day. This happens all across Europe at the moment, or it happens down, on the border to Mexico. And I think when you see some of those stories, when you see or hear what people have gone through, the lengths they've gone through just to be like on that beach in Greece with nothing to their name but like maybe a mobile phone and a hand of clothes, that you can't not feel empathetic. You can't not suddenly like try and like understand what someone's going through. And with that, like it definitely impacted me dramatically, and like my beliefs towards well, I mean, they were already in place, but it definitely provided like an extra level of empathy of like wanting to help people in that scenario. And the book goes into that a little bit, sometimes on like bigger scale like that, some it's like on like a smaller kind of sexual assault level, and like how that impacts a certain character. And not so much on this broader political scale, but like the individual decisions made by people and how those can harm others. And again, hopefully that provides some level of, someone reads it and maybe they connect to it, or it provides some empathy in that regard. I say empathy a lot, but I just think it's such an important word, and I think it's such an important thing in this current divisive political climate that we live in, because I think it's really been lost. I think nuance has been lost, and everything's just kind of so like black and white, left or right, whatever it is, and there's no room for people like human understanding. And I guess that's what I wanted to do with the book, to make it human.
Yeah, there's nothing wrong with that, and I do think fiction can have a lot of relatability to it, regardless if the stories are made up or not. Because ultimately, one thing you can do with fiction versus nonfiction is like you can romanticize it a little bit, dramatize it a little bit to make it a little bit more appealing to the average reader. Because I hear it in my comment section sometimes. Because like I have a One Piece big manga fan flag in my background, so people, when they hear something I say, they go like, "Oh yeah, shout out, your One Piece fan, blah blah blah," that might adhere to that, or they're really mad at what I'm saying and saying, "Oh, how can you have that One Piece flag? That doesn't adhere to what you're talking about." So it's very obvious that these people are very much affected by the ideals that a fictional story like that can have in terms of what they advocate for. Now, should that determine your values? I was always argue a fictional story should not determine your values,
No, of
but
course.
it should definitely, at the very least, shed a light of a very real scenarios. Because even though it's fiction, each of them come from a place that come from a real place, like a real understanding, a real a narrative that there is something valuable to take away from, to help either enforce or help shape your values with these unique experiences or unique mediums. Of course, when it comes down to you named like two examples of some stories that you're talking to. Are those your favorite, or if not, what is your favorite story that you believe has such a powerful message that everyone should really pay attention to when they read it?
Yeah, I mean, my favorite story of the book is actually the opening one, which is set in Guatemala. I'm very kind of influenced on this place where I used to live, though it's kind of imagines a more dark and like twisted version. I like that story the most. One, just on like a purely craft fictional level, I think it's like the best written story in the piece, and I think it really works well as a short story. But it's also, as mentioned earlier, I have a lot of love for Guatemala, for the people, for the culture. I think that Guatemala has a very interesting, well, not interesting, very sad, depressing history. And there was this coup that the CIA led in 1954. I don't know how much you or listeners know about it, but Guatemala had this President Arbenz in place, and afterwards a dictator was put in place, and then there was a genocide in Guatemala, and there's been like decades and decades of it's not being the most stable country in the world, and it's suffered a lot of hardships, and there's been like a attack on the Mayan people. And this story was very influenced by all of those things. Even though it's telling a fictional story set in this small village, it's very much about the wider context of how the US and US interests have impacted Guatemala as a whole, and the consequences of US involvement in Guatemala has had. And it's told through a small village. It's told through a few characters. It's told through one kind of US tourist and their actions at this beach town. But it's a wider commentary in general on like what the US has done to Guatemala and how that has ramifications. And I guess I like that story the most because I think that, I as I mentioned, I'm from the UK. I lived in Guatemala, and then we moved here to the US maybe 3 years ago. But when I talk to people, I live in California. There's a huge like Guatemalan communities in Mexican communities, El Salvadoran communities in Northern California where we live. And yet I talk a lot about Guatemala to people around here, and there's not many people. Some people have never even heard of it, which I always find baffling because it's like really close by. But if they have, no one knows much about the country. The main thing people always say to me is, "Oh, I hear it's really dangerous there." Or if they're of a certain political persuasion, they don't like the fact that there's so many like Guatemalans coming into the US, and there's never an understanding of like the historical like context around Guatemala and how Guatemala has been impacted over the last 70 years by the US, and the consequences of that have, I think laid a path to where we are at now. And so I like that story because it centers Guatemala and it talks about this country, but also it kind of gives a understanding of, or it gives an example of how the US has impacted it as a whole and what that means. So I guess that is probably my favorite. Yeah.
I think that's very interesting. When it comes down to me, I'm always hesitant. No, I wouldn't say hesitant. I always find it interesting, like how people kind of shape the United States, right? Obviously, you can tell I have an American flag in my background, and I'm pro America because obviously it's the top country, and I live here, and I feel like I've had a lot of rights to kind of do a lot of great things. But I never dismiss or deny that there are terrible things America has done. I mean, there's basically no civilization or country that has not done a terrible thing. So dismissing it and not using it to criticize a country is flawed. Like, you have to be able to understand that stuff. Go ahead.
Well, I'm from the UK, so the UK has a horrible history across the world, and in lots of different ways.
So I hear these things and I'm like, okay, that's fine. I'm perfectly fine with you criticizing. There's always eventually going to be a bad actor. I mean, we see a bad actor right now. I'm just saying that is like in charge of the country, that has power in the country, that use it for their own means. And there could be other agendas that use it for their own means at the end of the day. So that will always exist. But my thing is, the reason why I always be not proud. I don't really believe in pride, but support America is because I want to continuously improve it to ensure that this stuff does not happen, to ensure that America has the power and influence to push good because it has the capability of pushing good based off of values that are supposed to be embedded, that you learn as a kid on what America is supposed to represent. We're kind of losing that. Like, for example, the idea of the American dream. I feel like people heard about it, go like, oh yeah, the idea is you can come to America and make a life for yourself. And now we're going like, no, you're not allowed to come to America and make a life for yourself. So it's kind of backwards, but I'm going to keep on pushing what I think is good in those retrospects. So the reason why I bring this up, because I think what you brought up is very interesting in terms of another flaw of America, because these critiques are necessary, is when it comes to establishing justice, and when you have as much influence and supposed very good principles on why America was founded, although some people have used it for nefarious means, we all know this. Do you believe a country like America, or maybe another powerful country you could think of that actually has good ideals, should use their ability for good, for justice, and helping these other locations across the world to establish some the better community there? Because we know that America sometimes will get involved, or other countries will get involved when, for example, Ukraine, Russia just started invading Ukraine. America's like, all right, we got to help them out. So do you believe America should, or just countries like America should, get involved and help these countries and do help them with principles of justice, so to speak? Do you think that's even possible? Do you think that's warranted? I'm curious of your thoughts.
I mean, I think it very, I guess it depends on the motivation behind why you would get involved. Like we talked about USAID earlier, and the way that Western powers say have supported and helped countries around the world with aid, with nonprofit work, with that kind. I think is ultimately, obviously, as you say, there's always bad actors, but ultimately that's a good thing. And I think we should be supporting and propping up and helping countries that are less fortunate. It just depends on the motivation. I think that in the Guatemalan context, for example, there was a socialist leader who was doing like a large land reform across Guatemala that was trying to take power away from like the landowners and give more land to the people of Guatemala. But that included taking on the private business, the United Fruits Company, which at the time was the Dulles brothers were major players in the United Fruits Company. And one was, I think, head of CIA, one was Secretary of State, maybe, I can't remember. And they didn't like that their private businesses were under attack in a foreign country, and that played a big part in them persuading, I think it was Eisenhower, to then launch this coup and then put in this dictator who would be more kind of favorable to their United Fruits business. And so when it's that motivation, when it's getting involved for your own monetary reasons, that's not helping another country. That's taking advantage, and that's abusing another country. Same with, say, the British colonial project. It's driven by wealth and greed. Ukraine, or like if another, helping other countries if they're under attack, I think is, like Ukraine needed support. Equally, you could, to turn to Israel and Gaza, like now the US is pumping weapons and military ongoing into what is happening in Gaza, long, like we're so many, how long, coming up to 2 years down the road, and they're still continuing to attack this place where over 50,000 people have died, like 80, 90, 87% of civilians. And so in that scenario, I don't think US aid or UK aid, not to always be down on the US is a wonderful country in lots of ways. It is a land of incredible opportunity and innovation, all of these different things. I don't want this to be like just being a negative thing towards the US, because I admire and love the US in lots of ways. But I also think that the US and the UK and Belgium and France have all caused a lot of harm as well across the globe over history. And I think we should also be aware of that. And I think, yes, countries can help and can support other countries, but I think it's a case of seeing the motivation at the start of when you go in. Like, what is the motivation? What is driving you to go and support this, whatever this is? Why are you doing this? Is this for your own benefit? Is this for their benefit? And I think more often than not, those things can be very murky, and that causes problems.
Yeah, I'm definitely there with you that it is a very tough situation, and it can have some nefarious situations where there's people are not working in the best interest, and a lot of it tends to kind of relate to wealth, of course, and that how much power these individuals will have. And as we're seeing that is being a big driving force as of right now in terms of like America. So if we're using this current situation, an example which is like very interesting when you comes down to it, is that if we're trying to advocate for the principles of justice, and we're trying to advocate for certain embedded rights that we think are good, and trying to make people more empathetic in a circumstance that is like America now. Like, even though obviously I advocate for America and all that stuff, and I do think it's good, but I always call it out, and I'm very, very critical of things when they do things bad, because there's no way you can call this a perfect nation by any means. So when you have situations where you have powers to challenge, whether it's the Guatemalan example you've given it, whether it's our current situation with the current administration having so much power in all three branches, what is the best way to continuously advocate for these principles that we've been talking about?
Yeah, I mean, sorry, that's a reverb. I don't know. Like, I guess I don't know the best way for that, and I don't think I could even speak to that. I wish there was an easy solution, and I guess, I don't have an answer. I think what the book really like looks at, and actually like a general theme, it's not necessarily every story, but a general theme running through this book is that in a lot of these books, people do take their own justice or revenge into their own hands. They do what they think is own. One of this is like in this Guatemalan example, but one is like a man thinks that his wife is cheating on him, and so in kind of his like revenge, he cheats on her to kind of get his kind of personal justice, let's say. But in all of these scenarios that it explores, the general like consensus is that like getting this revenge or getting this justice that you take into your own hands doesn't provide people with like the kind of resolution that they were maybe hoping for. I don't think it leads to necessarily happiness. Sometimes it does, of course it does. In like history has proven that, where people have had to fight for what is theirs. But I don't think that like taking things into our own hands is always going to bring around that resolution you want. And the last story in the book really like, kind of looks in on that. And the character, we have a character from the first that comes back, and like he then has this moment where he could again go down that route around like taking reciprocal justice or, you know, doing something violent effectively. And then he has a moment where he's suddenly surrounded by family, people he has not seen in a while, and he has a support network around him, and he makes a different decision. And so I guess that's kind of like like one of the core themes of the book is that like I think that there needs to be, instead of like reaching this ultimatum that shows itself in different forms across different countries of needing to fight for your justice and needing to take what is ours, there just needs to be ultimately better systems in place, which is far easier said than done. And I don't think we're heading in that direction anytime soon. But I think that like when people have that system in place, like if there is better support from a state, if there is kind of stronger communities, or, you know, even things done by the state to build up community centers used to be like a big thing across the UK, and a lot of them have died. I don't know what it was like here in the US growing up, but there used to be like community centers where you bring people together for events and you build these communities, which I think is really important. And it stops getting us to some of these situations, you know, that if people are ultimately in a good position in their lives, then you're not forced into these measures. And it's a case of, which is, you know, it's very broad, but this I think can be the only way to like help.
No, I do think that is potent, and that kind of comes into one of our a new topic, and we'll probably make this like the kind of final overarching conversation we're about to have, because I do think there's a lot of very interesting elements that you've provided, is that trying to figure out what is justice. And I'm always this makes me think about like how I talk it, because I very critical of MAGA consistently. I just am, and I don't hide it. Even though I say like I am purple political breakdown, I adhere for my values. I just think there's just a party that currently is very problematic. Now I do criticize the left as well, and I do it consistently too, because I have issues over there as well. But when I come down to it, I always try to preface a very, very important message that just because I think they are terrible actors, just because I think this is a fascist government, just because I think they are doing very terrible things for America, does not mean I advocate for any means necessary justice. And I do think we are reaching a very, very concerning point in America as of the last like few years, with like the stuff what happened where the guy kind of lit like these two Israelis on fire. That was insane. The recent mass shooting that took place, that was insane. There's like more examples I could point out where it's like political violence, where it's like, oh, we're trying to get justice. It's like, this is not justice. Oh, the whole thing with the guy who killed the CEO of the United Kingdom.
I was going to say Luigi Mangione, and you know, that's an interesting example, because I know that was, and I've been involved in these discussions, but on the left, some people celebrated, you know, what happened with Luigi Mangione. But then I always would throw the thing, but what happens if that's someone that, you know, maybe you're against the CEO of a pharmaceutical has caused a lot of harm across the US, but what happens if that's someone that you support and believe in, but it comes from, say, someone from the extreme right who takes down, I don't know, like a Democrat member of Congress, whatever it is. Like, we can't, that's not a society that's going to ever move forward. And I agree. One thing I think that's interesting is that I think that what people like, the way, like, if you look at like January 6th, like a lot of those people felt potentially like their injustice, they felt an election was stolen from them. That wasn't the reality, in my opinion, and which I think is consensus reality, but that's what they believed. And so they felt that they would storm the Capitol to get like the justice that was owed to them for an election being stolen. And that did not lead to good results. That's not the way that a society can ever function. And so we can't just, all of our personal justices, we can't just like enact. And sometimes that's hard because sometimes there are incredible wrongs in this world that are being done. And this is why I'm going back to that last point. People are being wronged and they're not getting the support that they deserve. You know, racism is rife and the government is not coming in to like make that better. You know, anti-immigration rhetoric, xenophobia, even like the way that like people with like financial disparity, like all of these things are bad, and there's nothing that's being put in place to help that. But taking it into your own hands as well does not always lead to the best results. Which I guess I'm just returning to the same point in that like it needs human beings to care more for each other, to realize the different situations that people are in, and hopefully advocate for other people because they see that this, you know, this isn't a way to live for a lot of people. And I think that's like the central point. It's like caring, which again just sounds like such like a basic kind of point, but it's so like simple. But I guess if there was more of that in the world, then maybe it would be less divided as we currently are.
Yeah, it just takes a level of understanding that it is very possible, but sometimes people are not either able or willing to do when it comes down to these situations. Because you provided a very perfect analogy when it comes down to the situation with Luigi. It's like there will be those examples of the person on the other side kind of use the same type of logic that is being applied to enact their own version of justice. And we already hear, you know, some very it's ridiculous things where it's like, for example, when people would advocate very, very strongly that, you know, the entire country is racist. And I've made my point about this in terms of like systematic racism. It definitely existed, but there's levels to it when you call the entire system racist that is not helpful. And now we're seeing people on the right say like, oh yeah, now the country's systematically racist against white people. And I'm like, okay, all right, like what? What are we like? This is just, what are we doing? And they're just trying to use the same logic, and it's like it's ridiculous because the idea at the end of the day is we want to consistently improve problems that we do see, which is very understandable because we can constantly keep on improving their rhetoric regarding like racism, or the rhetoric regarding a wealth disparity, or the insurance, the issues regarding health insurance in America that is very problematic as well. But if you go and take justice in your own hands in a very, nefarious or bad way, then you're just setting it up for the other side to use that same tool to justify their own actions based off their own principles. And at that point, if it becomes a domino effect, then we got no systems to save at that point. There's nothing to kind of, strive for if everything is just constantly destroying each other.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of a lose-lose situation because, you need for you not to like fight, for people not to fight for their justice. Say it's like, racial equality or whatever, like you need systems in place that are people advocating for you as well. This is like what needs to be in place. And sometimes as you look through history, people have had to take that into their own hands and fight for what is not given. The US has obviously been through that journey. But, before we get to that point, it would be great if the systems in place or the people in place, like came to those realizations before it's needed to get to those extremes.
Do you think we need more stories and narratives from, I don't want to say necessarily the other side, but like the other point of view? I think that is a more potent way to say it. Like, for example, and I want to be very clear, I am not capping for billionaires. I do think that is a big issue in America, but most narratives and stories out there portray like billionaires as like terrible people. Like they're evil geniuses that are, X, Y, and Z. You could think of it like every superhero story, the billionaire, unless it's like Tony Stark. Tony Stark is probably the only one, but all of them are just like evil. I mean, and I'm trying to think of like what story of them are not evil. Well, I guess Batman is not evil either. So Batman, but like that one Christmas story with the what's his name, where he goes through the Ghosts of Christmas Past, like
yeah,
Scrooge.
Scrooge.
So that one is like, yeah, he was bad, but you got to kind of feel good for the billionaire by the end of the story. With that said, most narratives and most media, most stories paint these like billionaires as terrible people. So, do you think that is just used as an example? Do you think we need more narratives and different, more stories for like these points of views to kind of empathize with them, regardless of like if you think that they're on the other side? Do you think it is important we get their story though?
Yeah, I guess it depends on it. If like, say, I don't think there's like a place if someone's like got racist beliefs and they put that into a book, that there's a place for amplifying those beliefs and giving them
Yeah,
airtime.
agreed.
But at the same time, yeah, like I try as much as I can to check myself and like read news sources that aren't just my own kind of echo chamber, and try and like understand why people believe certain things from a different point of view. I think that the left has like made a big mistake in over recently, like Democrats, and like there's like a vilification of everyone, like you say, like that everyone on this side is evil and everyone on this side is good. And I think like first that's an oversimplification, and I don't think that like everyone who voted Republican is inherently like racist or homophobic or whatever it is. I don't believe that to be the case. Obviously, there are quite a lot probably who are, but like that's not helpful to just say you're bad, we're good, or whatever. And I think that if it's asking people from like say the MAGA base to read or consume content which from a different point of view, then I think it is important to try and understand the other point of view as well. And I think that, literature there's not many publishing houses who probably do that, and for various reasons. But I don't know, I do think it's important to consume content that isn't just saying the stuff that you like. I think it's good to listen to other people's voices and just at least try and understand why they might believe it. Like the white working class in the US and the UK have taken, like, it hasn't been a good period for them over the last however many years. And in the UK, the white working class is often just like vilified as, reform voters or, racist, anti-immigrant. And there is a lot of that in that. But also there's a lot of white working class communities that ever since like the 80s or whatever, when Thatcher closed down loads of industries, have really like struggled. And there are, good people in there who don't hold those beliefs. And, I think you need, like, we can't just lump everyone into you are this, you are this, you are this, because people blur across these boundaries. People have different, more nuanced political beliefs. People have reasons behind why they believe certain things that deserve at least to be listened to or understood, because otherwise it's just going to create increased hate, increase like divides. So I think it is good to try and just like understand, or for information to be provided in like a less biased way, to say like, here is a document of what they're saying and why, and like to put it in like, straight up terms, and people can take that quote whichever way they want to take it. But it doesn't have to be like a forced political narrative always put down in our throat. And I think people deserve to be listened to, even if you don't agree with them.
Yeah, I very much agree. That can help a lot. Like one of my favorite movies, fictional story, just thought of it, is it's just a top movie that I very much enjoyed, American Gangster. And that was a movie with Denzel Washington and the other guy, just forgetting his name. But that movie shared the perspective of this cop who was like not all good. He would cheat on his wife, for example. He was not the greatest father. Sometimes he would just do things that are not always okay. But for the most part, he takes his job seriously. He's not a corrupt cop by any means. And he wants to do good, even though he has individual issues going on. And then we got this gangster who we follow his journey and how he grew up and how he wanted to make something from himself. And obviously he went down the bad path. And then at the end of the movie, you see, he gets arrested. He's done some terrible things, but they eventually work together and to get all the rest of the gang bosses that are doing terrible things. And it's like that, those two perspectives were super valuable, where it's like yes, the cop was probably more good, but you see the issues. He had issues. The gangster had issues, but there's goodness. There's good things in that gangster as well. And it was just a very important story. So just more narratives and more outlining of like this nuance, especially
Mm.
when you got stuff in America where it's like, I understand we want to all like hate certain individuals for like certain things, but like when some people demonize the entire white population, I'm like, yeah, I hear you, but at the same time, they're the majority of the population in America. So it's like you demonize all of them, they're just going to vote for one guy. And then what now? Then what are we going to do there? So
I think that's like a really important point. It's like people, I think people are being told that they're something, and sometimes that's not the case, and people are being like vilified, and as a result, that pushes them away from wanting to, if you're told that you're, say, homophobic because you voted for Trump, you might well be homophobic, but you might well not be. And it's like, and just to have like an identity put on you or a belief system put on you that maybe isn't necessarily true isn't helpful. And it just pushes people further apart. So yeah, I think across the board, like greater listening to the other side is always important. And you don't have to agree. No one has to agree. No one's going to agree. But, like if you think back through history, like the Greeks and the Romans, they built their societies on like, or, debate was such a big thing. And these auditoriums where they would discuss all of these issues and come together. And I think, I think there's always place for debate. I just think at the moment it's so heated that debates don't stay debates very long and they quickly turn into arguments. But I think that, a greater, if more people took a chance to try and understand what others were going through, then I think we would be in a better place.
I agree. So as we wrap up today's podcast episode, is there anything else you want to say? Obviously, feel free to plug your book again. Any final words for you?
Yeah, I mean, firstly, thank you so much for having me on. I've really enjoyed this conversation. I've been on various different podcasts, but this is probably the one where it's been most interesting to have these back and forth and talk about these issues, because I think they're really important and it's really good to talk about them. But yeah, for anyone listening who would like to read the book, it's a collection. It's called "And So I Took Their Eye." You can find it on all of the normal sites like bookshop.org or Amazon or in some bookshops. And it's also, you can go on my website, www.bendaviesauthor.com. And you can also find me on Instagram and Substack under that same, the handle at Ben Davies Author. But yes, please do read the book. Please feel free to send me an email, reach out to me if you want to discuss it. I love to talk about it. And thank you so much for having me on board.
No problem, man. If you had to just restate like the most important message that you want people to get out of from the book, what would that be?
To care for for human beings, that we need to break out of these labels that we put people in and actually take a moment to like try and understand or empathize with what a lot of people are going through right now in the US and abroad. And I think we should all do that, take a second to do that and try and put ourselves in other people's shoes, because I think we could all learn a bit from doing that.
All right, excellent. Well, with that said, ladies and gentlemen, all his information is in the description. Feel free to check it out for sure. Again, if you enjoyed, rate the podcast 5 stars, share with your friends and family. Y'all have a good one. Take care and peace.